Hey everybody, and welcome to the Rabbit Trail Podcast. This is the podcast where we're going to chase the truth wherever it runs as we pick up ideas and themes from the sermons at Olive Branch Community Church. And this episode is episode number 152.
Yes, it is.
Yes, and we are excited that you guys are joining with us. If this is your first time, we're glad that you're joining with us. My name is Greg Harris. I'm the senior pastor here at the church that sponsors the podcast, Olive Branch Community Church. And again, like I said, we kind of are jumping off of themes and picking up stuff that was kind of left off in the sermon, which I didn't preach this week. Instead, my buddy Stephen here, he preached. And so why don't you say hi and let them know everybody. What to do.
Hello, my name is Stephen Oldham. I'm the local outreach pastor here at Olive Branch. And I got to preach last week. It was fun. We're going to get into the text. But I just want you to know if you're watching us on YouTube, make sure you subscribe and you like and let us know. Send a comment. We got a few comments today. But if you're watching on Spotify or you're watching on any of the other services, make sure that you also subscribe there and put in a comment there if you can. Some of them have comments. Like I have to check some of those lately because I haven't seen some in a while. But yeah, they're there sometimes.
And you might even want to engage with us because you have a question or you want to enter into the conversation at a different level, maybe a little bit more long form than some comments might let you. You can just drop us a line at our email, rabbittrail@obcc.church. That's rabbittrail. That's 2 T's right there in the middle at obcc.church. We'd love to hear from you. Pick up your questions, give you some answers, hear your comments, feedback, whatever it is. And I think you'll notice we are a duo that is normally a trio this week, and we do not have our buddy Brent. He's on vacation. We're hoping that he's having a good time wherever he went. It was like in Oregon, and then he was flying to Idaho. Like, I don't know why.
Wow.
Yeah. Hey, for all of you in Idaho, we're glad you're there. It's not cold here. Well, it's rainy, but, we're just glad that you guys are watching with us and enjoying. And so shout out to you all in Idaho and to you, Brent, when you're listening to this. So what we usually do at this point is we dive into some questions into some jokes like Brent and his terrible jokes. But like we said, we don't have Brent here. So we decided to invite a new person onto our podcast. I guess it's not a person, but a new thing onto our podcast, ChatGTP. He's going to give you a couple quick cheesy jokes. So we just ask it real quick here. Give me a cheesy Christian joke. And he goes, sure, here's one for you. Why didn't they play cards on the ark? The answer, because Noah was always standing on the deck. Yeah, it doesn't get much better from there. It's got some pretty, why did the Pharisee bring a ladder to church? Because he wanted to be on a higher level than anyone else. Wink. I mean, it gives me emojis after this. Like the worst one.
You emojis?
Yeah, it's literally putting emojis. Who is the greatest comedian in the Bible? Samson, he brought down the house. You probably heard. I think Brent actually told that one.
Now we know where he's getting his sources from.
Yes, obviously Brent is ChatGTP, so I'm just going to go ahead and boo this.
We're farming off his job.
Too cheesy. And it says to us, got it. Let me set up my joke game for you. Here's 4 that are still Christian themed, but a little bit more clever. It's still horrible. Why did Jesus make such good coffee? Because he brews it. Bad. All right, done.
I have seen that on a shirt.
Oh gosh. What kind of car would Jesus drive? A Chrysler, because he's got the whole world in his hands?
I don't know. I get the Chrysler part.
I really, really don't understand. All right, so thanks, ChatGTP. You did about as good as Brent does. So
Pretty close. You're going to farm out your job with technology.
So we're done with that. Why don't we head on over from Brent's normal section? It says, Stephen, you've got some first impressions you're looking at here. Do you want to let people know what this is all about?
Yeah, we're going to go into the darker side of the internet here. Just look at some of the comments from the last couple of weeks. Let me scroll through a few here. Right. There's a lot of positive ones here.
But not the dark side of the interweb, right?
So some of it's light side. But there's one here that it just says the power of worship beyond rock concerts and church. And the person just put no. No reference.
Mic drop.
It wasn't even a question. I mean, usually they're like tags to get questions in on the shorts, but this was just like the power of worship. And they're like, no, there is no power of worship.
Don't want worship. Don't want power. Don't want power of worship.
I just have this person like mentally like just vegging out and scrolling through their
and sees one and they're just
scrolling
like,
and they're just like, no, that's the one I want to comment on.
No.
So then the other one was on one for you back a while ago. It's breaking free from rules, embracing spiritual growth. And it's talking about the weaker brother and the person who's more mature.
Oh, yeah.
And this person just goes, how does he know that the weaker brother doesn't like to feel weak? Because you say that in the video. I said, me thinks he is describing himself. Dun, dun, dun. He's
Yeah, me thinks I said that in the video.
You did say that in the video. I've been a weak person before, and so
I am still weak in places to this day. Yes, I am describing myself. You found me out.
Oh, no. He's got you. He's got your number.
I hope not.
So then there's some positive ones on COVID and things like that. Then you see the concept played itself out in the Old and New Testament. So breaking free from the rules. You're talking about spiritual growth. So that person was like, yeah, on board. But then there's one that's like, I don't understand I really don't understand the question. I guess it's like a Rorschach test. You could take it any way, good, bad, or positive. So I'm just going to read this as is. And you tell me if you know what it's saying.
I get to get the first impression?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I can jump in with you, but I'm going to need help in trying to understand this rubric. So this is a comment called Understanding Marriage, Jesus' Teaching and Relationships. So basically in the video, you're just talking about men and marriages, sex between a man and a woman meant for marriage. And then just kind of saying, oh no, we have to say that.
Yeah, I think it was a context of I'm like preaching on we have to stand in our culture on
for certain things
that are, or you're going to say certain things. This is what it was. We're going to say certain things that should prompt people to have questions. And statements like this should prompt you to ask questions. Ask your questions. That's kind of what I was getting at in that part of the sermon.
So this person, Thor Asgard, so he might be a pagan. I'm not quite sure. He might believe in the All-Father. So the no sex till marriage would sadly result in the Christians dying out in the next 50 years, as no modern woman would accept a good man. And I'm like, at that point, I was like, are you for that or against that? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is it good that there's no sex before marriage would sadly result in Christians dying out, which is probably not
true. Sadly, they don't. Well, yeah, would sadly result because he's sad about it, or sadly as in because
oh dang, that's sad,
or sadly like that was what. Because I'll just be honest, I don't know what he's talking about. Because you come to our church, there are babies everywhere.
Yes.
And they are all married people that have all the babies everywhere, or they may be some single moms, but it's pretty rare for a Christian who's raised in the church to not want to get married and have kids.
The two giant demographics growing in the next 50 years is going to be Muslims and Christians, because they have lots of children. Mostly religious people have children.
Also, I find that very Western centric. Yeah. Like the
tribal groups,
largest populations of Christians are happening in Africa and China, and like even in Chinese Christians outside of China.
Family's a big part.
Are having big families because they want to pass their faith on to their kids. Like it's part of like our thinking as Christians is to have larger families so that you can have opportunity to pass on to kids, and you want to have sex within the confines of marriage because it produces a healthier marriage, it produces a healthier home, and therefore produces better opportunities for your children and a better picture of what Christianity is about for your kids. Anyway,
the other part is this sentence is, those days are sadly gone. So they were sad that they happened, or were sad that they're gone. I don't know what part of the sad we're on, but I'm trying to figure this out legitimately. And then it says, we have to live with that sin and not be okay and not be okay with it, but accept it. But isn't that the same thing? If I accept a sin, then I'm okay with it, or am I just holding my breath?
You mean accepting that people live together before they get married, and so therefore... Because that's what a reference is.
I don't know. I'm trying to figure it out. Legitimately trying to figure it out. So I guess if you say that no sex till marriage would result in this thing, if that's a bad thing, then we should accept that, even though it's not good. So that doesn't make sense to me either, because you wouldn't want to accept a good thing. You'd want a bad thing. You'd want to fight for it. And what they're finding is, I'm finding now, even secular people who don't believe, like I said, they don't believe in God, they are already rooting for marriage now, because they're seeing a lot of these demographics falling off, and they're seeing a lot of stuff happening. And so people like Tim Pool got married recently because he had a baby and he wanted to make sure that baby was born in a family.
Now, granted, most people in our culture, non-Christian and even lots of Christians, are actually moving in together before they get married. My point is that the Bible very clearly says don't do that. Says like you leave your father and your mother to cling to your wife. That's the verse on marriage, and Jesus endorses that. So it is not part of the Christian ethic to live with your fiance and have sex with your so-called future wife until you've made the commitment, because then you're devaluing the human. The value has to be, I've committed my life to yours, you've committed your life to mine, and now I valued you correctly, and therefore sexuality is open. Without that commitment before a congregation, before God, in a marriage ceremony, where that commitment has teeth and kind of what we would call a covenant, not just a, hey, I like you, like you're always gonna sell yourself out for something lower.
Yeah, the other thing about marriage is that everybody thinks, well, it's just a piece of paper, and I'm like, no, because if you get divorced, or even if you just live together and you have to go through all these court battles, that costs society money, it costs judges, it costs things that have to do with like holding up other people in court. So no one just is an island unto themselves. Like if people have kids and they get divorced, that's an effect on the culture too. So the idea that someone's marriage doesn't affect society is not necessarily true. Like birth rates and death rates are a big part of whether a country is healthy. And so everybody has a stake in people having families, whether they have them themselves or not. That's why they need to be healthy and taken care of. That's why people care for children and watch out for them. So even countries that were pro-atheist for many years, like in like a Russian or communist country, has now struggled with what do they do with their birth rates dropping so badly. Right. And so they're trying desperately to get people to get married and have children.
Now, I think what also our culture gets lost in is that I'm painting obviously God's command, and therefore what is the ideal? That ideal is supposed to inspire you, not call you, not
make you feel all bad,
make you feel all like, oh, well, that's impossible, and defeat you. Second is that just because I'm just speaking out the aspirational truth that Scripture gives us doesn't mean I think that that's how it's always going to happen.
Yeah,
like obviously that's not how it's always going to happen. I'm not an idealist in that sense that
right.
Our world isn't broken. Like that's also part of our story. While I can tell you what God intends,
we're all going to fall short.
God also told us we're sinners and we won't do these things. I just want to tell people, hey, look, there's a better way, and the consequences aren't as grave for like your marriage. It is harder when you've had you've had sex outside of the marriage, and it does bring in complications to your marriage. For some people, it's not as complicated as for others. I'm not saying that there aren't people out there who's slept around a lot before they got married, and they found the perfect person, and everything's of course that stuff happens. But on the statistical norm, if you move in and you've been living together and you've been sleeping around, your marriage has a harder time making it for the rest of your life. It's just that's just kind of an evidential sociological reality. So, but again, that's interesting. I don't know.
So
I'm glad you're sadly not sad about being sad.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Thor, Asgard, Odin's son, if you want to clarify your question, we'd be lovely.
We shall therefore speak thou in this language, and thou shalt know.
We'll be more than welcome to comment on it. We did get a legitimate question here, though, and this was in Unlock the Key to True Salvation, Understanding Legalism. And you're talking about the difference between legalism and libertinism.
Or antinomianism is the other term. That's a big term out there. So,
and the person says, so then where's the middle? What is our obligation? He's talking about obligation to the law. Which commandments do we follow if saved by grace? And so there's people who err on one side who believe like, I have grace, I can do whatever I want, I'm free. And then there are people who are like, no, we have to be legalistic on every little thing and make laws even harder on ourselves so that we never ever possibly have the possibility of sinning.
So again, I think that a couple of things. This is a very complicated conversation within the church. I have summarized it simply down to, we as Christians now have the law written on our hearts. It is not written on paper. So Romans chapter 7 would say, in that sense, you're free from the law. But what Paul doesn't mean is that you're free to go sin whenever you want. If I have a relationship with God, who is the goodness and the beauty, and he saved me from my rebellion, or from my failing at doing what he's asked me to do, why would I then go receive that forgiveness and then go purposely do it again? Paul goes into that in Romans chapter 6. He's like, you don't go sinning on purpose after you've received Jesus. You're free from the law, but you don't do that. So his answer comes in Romans chapter 8, where he says, praise be, we got the Spirit of God within us. So now we have this opportunity to present ourselves before God, to be used by God, and God, the Spirit of God's within us so that we live out the very laws of God in our life because he's present with us in a relationship. In other words, Jesus summed it up in love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, and you'll fulfill all the commandments. When you walk in a nature of love, when you walk in relationship with God, when you are wanting to please him and connect with him, you end up doing the very things that God wants, and you don't end up sinning. It's not a legalism in that sense where it's like, oh, these rules said I have to do this, 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 this. It's a relationship. I would go to the Lord if I'm missing church on Sunday, like, God, check my heart. Am I doing this for the wrong reasons? Am I ignoring the community of God because, I just am bored with this church thing? Like, oh, you know what? I just want to go do sports or whatever. Check my heart, God. Am I being judgmental about, because there are so many things the law doesn't even cover,
right,
that you can be convicted about. And that's where, again, another verse that's very, close to me because I had to write an entire thesis for my master's degree on it, is the fruit of the Spirit.
Yeah.
And it says the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. And he just finished telling the Galatians, like, if you're going to lock yourselves under the law to rule your flesh, you might as well go all the way and mutilate yourself, because your circumcision is going to give you nothing. And he's like, look, but that doesn't mean you're going to give into your flesh, because that leads to, and he lists all these horrible things that the flesh does. And he's like, the Spirit's in you. Follow the Spirit, and you'll produce all these behaviors that there's no law against. And so in that sense, we would say that we've become a people of relationship with the Lord. And that relationship is led by the presence of his Spirit, the conviction that he gives us. And so we go, then what good is the law? And I think you answered it pretty well. It's the principle, right? Do you want to explain what you meant by that?
Yeah,
we were talking before.
I do believe that every law that is just and good has a principle behind it about how relationships and how people should interact with each other. And if you keep those principles, if you learn in studying the Old Testament, what is the principle behind that law, what you'll learn is the kind of God that you serve and the kind of belief about what justice really is and how we treat each other. And so then whether it applies to you or not, knowing that helps you kind of think through how should you treat people, how should you treat God. And so it's more about what is the principle behind the law. And sometimes the law isn't even necessary. You can learn about old laws. People have done this. They found old laws and they make no sense to us because they have no relation to what we are currently doing with one another. But at the time they were relational and they made a lot of sense about what to do and what not to do. And so we have this thing where laws are black and white. Laws are always relational, and they're always meant to kind of form out an idea of what people should do. An unjust law conforms to something that isn't good, and we argue for
it's
what is good.
It's a part of broken relationship, and it codifies a broken relationship.
But it also doesn't define all that's good. Like you said, like there are a lot of things that aren't against the law because they're good, and no one would make a law. One would order you to love your mom, though you in a sense of a legal system in a civil court, but the fact that you do isn't against the law either. So like there are a lot of things that go above what we have legal standards for that are good to do.
In fact, if you think of a law, the law is the least
amount
you should be doing.
Yeah.
At least don't kill your neighbor.
Right.
And I find this fascinating because I've been practicing praying through the Lord's Prayer pretty every day. And one of the fun things I do is I'm constantly meditating then on this very powerful prayer that Jesus has given us. And I got caught today the other day, I got caught in your kingdom come. And suddenly I realized when I get there, there's moments where I want to pause and I start going through the 10 Commandments because that's the rubric of his kingdom, right? And I'm like, your will be done. And then those are actually a great way to lock down like the 10 Commandments. You've got his kingdom commands, like only him, no other gods, no idols. Don't ignore don't take his name in vain. Well, I just prayed, I want your name to be made holy. And then on top of that, it's like, listen to take the Sabbath day, spend time with me, make sure that you've got, you're honoring the authorities, starting with your parents at least. And then it gets into, don't kill, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie. And then, don't have a twisted envy or gluttony. Don't have twisted desires.
Yeah.
Is the best way to do the 10th one. And if you want to know kind of how those apply out, we did a whole series a couple years ago called the relational, I think it was the relational playbook. And we went over the 10 Commandments and showed how they're just the basics for all of this stuff that is out there. And it applies in so many beautiful ways. So again, I'm not actually against the law. I believe the law informs my soul. It resonates with me. I'm not wooden literal with the law because like you said, a law about a parapet around the top of my house doesn't match. But but it would definitely match up if I'm trying to build something without some kind of ADA consideration or safety consideration for somebody, like a legitimate safety concern.
The principle is care about your neighbor and not just care about your own neighbor, your own house.
Right. And so, or don't care about the low, it's cheaper if I don't put a parapet up or a little wall so that you don't fall off.
And you see this transition even in the text. The Bible talks about the laws that were applied at one point that change when they get into Jerusalem because the scenarios change, but the principles of the law never change. They're kind of like case precedent. So you're looking at this old law that no longer applies, but the principles there you apply to a new law and try to do something that's relevant to the culture. So this is how law works. I mean, the whole legal system that we have in our country, it owes a lot of its credence to the Old Testament, and we are so used to that being the law, we don't understand the principles behind it. So to me, a natural law, the idea of natural law, is a biblical principle that says that it's not like a black and white thing, that there is a way in which objectively we should care for one another.
Which is actually a great illustration of how you as a Christian would begin to relate to this problem. At first, you might have some really concrete rules about your life that you're like, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do that, because you know it led you to sin. And then you begin to grow in your relationship with God, and you begin to realize, oh, those things I don't need to do anymore, because the principle that I learned from those is I want to love the Lord. And so Jesus just bottom lines it, right? Love the Lord with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. When you do these things, you fulfill all the commands in the Old Testament. And guess what? You're going to fumble around at first about that.
Yeah.
You're going to think love is being this way or being nice or whatever. And you find out, oh no, I learned a little bit more. And God's gracious to you. But the core question to me when it comes down to this is, do you have a case of the want tos or the have tos? If you're running around thinking you have to, and you're living under law in a way that you are fundamentally opposed, because that's an oppositional, I have to do this. Well, that stinks. Like, you may do it because you want to honor God, but the have to consideration, God wants it to move into your heart so you want to, because of what he's done for you. I do think there are some things that started have tos, and that's you have to do the good. That's good.
Why they're considered immature at that point.
But eventually, when I practice the good, I become somebody who wants to do the good, not just has to do the good.
And the Levitical laws that are the laws in the Old Testament that we're still adhering to typically are closer to something that is even more like the attributes of God, something about we're created in the image of God. So you're going to see a lot of that be way more consistent, because you don't kill regardless of the circumstances when it comes to murder, not necessarily other things. But that's pretty much been the principle from the beginning. Right from the beginning of Cain and Abel, murder has always been bad. And the idea is that never changes, because you're talking about the image of God, and some things are going to be consistent in law. How they're carried out in the law is going to be kind of different, maybe culture to culture. So that's what I see. And so there are other things like, how do we get along with the way we build our houses towards our neighbor? Well, it depends on how you build your house, but the principles are going to be the same. Mm-hmm. Don't just do whatever you want and not care for anyone else and then cause someone to get hurt, Right. So, but yeah, those are principles that seem common sense, but I don't think they are.
Cool.
That's it, really. There's a lot more, but mostly good stuff.
Well, you actually, I'll take over from here, because Stephen, you actually preached the sermon this week, and you were preaching on Jesus in focus. And I know you and I have had a lot of conversations about this passage, because we were setting it up so you could preach it. And thank you for doing that. And for everybody that's watching and listening right now, we hope that you're listening carefully and not. But really, what's interesting is that we just thought, hey, why don't we walk back through this passage?
Yeah,
because you were really kind of driving us through the passage from the perspective of the disciples, and then kind of, hey, what would God's perspective be? And that was kind of what you landed on. But what I want to do is kind of pick up some of the stuff we had talked about that didn't fully make it in because of time and things like that. And mainly, I wanted to talk about like the Exodus and Old Testament backgrounds that are just flowing through Mark's version here. Then they'll let you also go off on the military problem because I know that's a big deal for you.
It is a concern for me.
So why don't we do this? We'll go ahead and I'll read the texts, and then we can work through the commentary together a little bit. And so if you guys, again, are interested in joining us in this conversation, maybe it's going to prompt some questions. Let us know either online in the comments or let us know by actually sending us that email.
The other thing I will say is for those who watch the Bible study, I went through it as a disciple first, and then I went through it looking at it from more of a Christ-centered position, like what we should focus on him. But that's typically how I start to read. This might sound terrible, but that's how I often read the Bible. That's why rereading the Bible when you're studying is important.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify why you did that for maybe some of the people who didn't get to hear the message fully and completely. And that's because there's this very interesting text. So the summation of what we're going to look at is the disciples get back, they're exhausted. Jesus says, let's go get some rest. They get in a boat, they sail across the Lake of Gennesaret, Sea of Galilee, however you want to call it, same thing. And they come to the other side, and they wind up having a giant crowd that's followed them there. And Jesus has compassion and starts preaching and teaching to them in their rest time, right? And then suddenly it's late. Apparently he's taught for a long time, and they know they're hungry, and he says, give them food, and he feeds the 5,000. And then the next picture, as he releases them, he goes up and prays. They're struggling to get it back across at night to the other side of the lake. And then Jesus comes walking on the water, one of the most powerful, famous sections in all of the scriptures. And then it lands with this. When he gets into the boat, it says, and those who...
52 or
52, and it's the weirdest verse because it always catches me off guard. Starting at verse 51, it says, and he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded. Why? For they did not understand about the loaves, and their hearts were hardened. And you're like, what? What do the loaves have to do with him walking on water? And so that leads to this, like, oh, I need to read through this again. And the way that I understood this was like, Mark's giving you like a wink, wink.
Yeah.
He's going like, I know you read this and you're not hardened like the disciples here. You understood what was going on.
You got it, right?
You got it.
No.
And some of us are like, if you didn't, you go back and you read and you go, oh, and that's why you reference the Sixth Sense.
Yeah. Well, the thing is interesting is I do find the Bible is much more colorful and literary than we give it credit for. And so I do think if you go, I want to be in on the know, what did I miss? You go back and read it again. I remember when I got to the end, because in church we often break things into segments so much. I knew both of the stories, but for some reason I never caught that. And so I read it that way first time, and then I'm like, okay, now I got to study why that is the case. And at that point, you have to decide, do I skip this or do I go back
like
and...
so many commentators.
Yeah, and go back and look at it. And I like that about the Bible, that it's not going to be like spoon feed you, that it's assuming you're curious enough to want to look at it again. And they don't write linearly. I know we really are fascinated with stories that go A, B, C, and then bam, the ending, right? Well, the Bible doesn't always do that. Sometimes it just starts a story and then gives you the key point in the middle and then just keeps moving on. Sometimes it wants you to reread through it and look at it a different way. And so I think it's a fascinating form of just literature in and of itself.
This isn't the last time they're going to talk about the loaves either. In fact, one of the reasons this theme is locked together, the reason we did the Aperture series, we're talking about the idea of the spiritual darkness your aperture being open and God allowing more spiritual light in, is because in chapter 8, that's 2 chapters later, they get into the same conversation in the boat while talking about, what did you bring any food? Did you bring any kind of bread? And then there's this they have this big argument, and then this will be the last sermon of the series, and they go like, oh, and let's get out of the boat and heal this guy in a weird double healing thing that's like the strangest miracle in all of the Bible. And so we'll kind of dive into that. But let's go back to the text and we can go backwards or go back up to the top here as we begin. So I'm going to kind of read the text, and then we'll kind of get moving in it together. So we're here. If you've got a Bible, you can join us. It's Mark chapter 6. We're looking at verse 30, and it says, the apostles, and note they call them the apostles right off the mark.
It's the first time, and I think maybe the only time in Mark that they use the apostles. I think I looked it up, but I know it's the first time the word apostles used in the book of Mark.
I'll double check that real quick.
Yeah, I think I looked it up, but I could be wrong. But it's just interesting that before they were called the disciples, they sent out and did what they were told to do. Yep. Now they're being called apostles.
Yeah, this is the first time that they're called the apostles.
Yeah, so it's great because it's like, oh, okay, you're an apostle when you do what I tell you to do, and you do it. Until then, you're just a disciple, right?
They were a disciple when they followed.
Yeah.
Now they're apostles when they were sent.
So to me, as a Christian, that's really convicting, because the very first thing I'm thinking is, if I don't do, I'm not an apostle. I'm not a messenger, is what that... someone who has been sent.
Yeah, and so in our world, we are not saying that we are the 12 apostles.
12 apostles, no.
Who are going to become the foundations of the Christian faith.
And write scripture.
This is, we would say that there are big A apostles and little A apostles. And little A apostles can be thought of as sent ones, missionaries, emissaries, these who go possibly to plant churches, those who go to other countries and cultures. And there's specific kinds of people who do this kind of stuff. Now, I believe all of us are called to be disciples.
We all have a commission of a kind, not maybe necessarily like the disciples did, but we do have God saying, go into all the world and make disciples.
And so I'm not going to get into the theological debate about whether or not only these apostles had the right to cast out demons or anything else. I don't know a Christian denomination necessarily. I'm sure there are some, but I don't personally know of one that's saying like, that's only with them. Even the Catholic Church wouldn't say that's only with them. They would claim that it's held within their own church in certain places. And and Protestant churches routinely believe that the gifts that were given to the apostles are given to us when we are on our missions as well and engaged.
Yeah, just the word in Greek, it doesn't mean this one
it means
who is
emissaries.
Emissary, one who's sent.
Yeah, it really
we should, a very niche word, the smallest version of it.
Really should never have been just transliterated over. I just don't think it's helpful to our language. It's not ambassadors, but it's emissaries. It's like it's a commissioned person. Yeah. Somebody who's been commissioned to bring a message.
So they may have a unique commission, but we all have a commission, at the very least, to go out and tell people about Jesus.
So the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. Now, this actually for me was a big leadership thing. What I love about Jesus is that in his leadership, he made them very clear what he was calling them to do. He says, I want you to go out and do this specific thing with this way, depending on God. And then when they got back, he asked them, I think it was like, did you do it? I want to hear everything that you did. It's like send, come back, report. And for all of us who are like leaders, I think it's a critical thing to realize that Jesus used very basic, good leadership skills. They return, they tell him all that they had done and taught. And now that he's heard about it, they've reported in, they give him an account. And I think that's critical for anybody who's a Christian. Like, if you've got to report things, be a faithful reporter. If you're sent to go do something, go do it, come back and report. I'm not saying we have to run to God every time and go, God, I did what you told me to do. But
I do think God.
It might be helpful to come back and tell your small group. It might be helpful to come back and tell somebody that you've been with as a way of account. So
I'll tell you, just as the outreach person, I want to hear those stories.
Absolutely, come tell us.
I would love to hear what you've done. When people have come up and told me, I want to pray for you. I want to support you, but I'm excited. I think Jesus he knows what's going to happen, but he still wants to hear it. So it's kind of like, I send you out, but I want you to come back and tell me the stories.
I don't think he knows the specifics, but I know he knows the general plan is going to work.
He knows that I've sent you and to do this, and and they're going to come back to him, and he still wants to hear it. I just love that.
And again, the other piece here is that all they had done and taught. There it is, the two wings again. It's not
doing and teaching.
It's not just teaching, and it's not just doing. They were supposed to do both, and so that is a great summation of the Christian mission. You're supposed to go do and teach. If you ignore one of those two, we're not doing the mission. So anyway, just my thoughts on that one. So it goes on, and he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." for many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away to the boat to a desolate place by themselves. I'll pause right there for a second. Now, we've just seen this word twice, a desolate place. Did you do any looking into that at all?
Yeah, it's the same word that's translated, and Jesus was taken to the wilderness.
Yep. Yeah.
It's the exact same word in the Greek. It's also the similar. There's a couple of words in Hebrew that translated wilderness that it can be both, but it's also that idea of being put into the wilderness out in the middle of nowhere, like they were in Exodus as well.
Yeah. In fact, the first time Mark uses the term, he's talking about John the Baptist being in the wilderness, the desolate place, right? You could literally translate, come away by yourselves to the wilderness and rest.
And rest a while, which is an odd place to choose to now we find out there's some grass there, so that's cool, but it's still a very dangerous place to be away from everything else. But I just like the idea of God going, we can rest anywhere if you're with me. You know what I mean?
In fact, this is where in Mark 1:35, Jesus goes by himself to a desolate place,
to the wilderness,
where
the Satan tempts him
away from everyone, and there he prayed. No, this is after.
This is after that.
This is after that.
Oh, okay.
He would routinely get away. I've been watching The Chosen, and it's always like, where'd Jesus go? They didn't know where he ever went, and it's like the implication is he's been away, spending time in some desolate, meaning people can't find you, you're alone place, and so he's like, we're gonna go do that together. Let's get away where people can't find us, and let's rest a while. And so twice he says, let's get away from civilization and so this is the first retreat, right?
It is I still do think it's an odd place to retreat, but I think the lesson is compared when you talk about it to the storm, right? Like you can rest in the Lord. It isn't necessarily circumstantial in many ways or location specific. It is good to get away, but the idea is that who you get away with is more important than the place that you get away to. So the better to pick a place.
And what you get away with. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. It's better to get to a place where there isn't enough, that you're not distracted, I think is important to think about in the principle of the location. What kind of places do you want to get away and not be distracted? That's important, but it's more important with who you're with.
Now, it is interesting that the beginning of this is that Jesus is like, let's get away to a desolate place to rest. And then the commentary is, because many were coming and going, they didn't even have time to eat. They didn't have
leisure to eat.
And suddenly, and this is going to be an entire story about eating.
Yeah.
Right? It's like...
It comes after the story about another banquet that had John the Baptist and they were eating.
Yeah, you talked about that. Get into that. You read a commentator.
Yeah, and some of the commentators the thing about the Bible is neat is it builds on each other. And sometimes when we read it chapter for chapter, we just need to look back at the chapters we read real quick, because people on the commentary are comparing this feast where everybody's satisfied with just bread and fish, and the banquet where John the Baptist's head is beheaded. They're having almost like an orgy in many of the commentaries, because they're supposed to split the two. There's supposed to be men partying on one side and women. That's not the kind of party they were having. And so when it was like this, huge feast that they were having with John the Baptist was being asked to be beheaded, compare that to that guy thinks he's a king. Jesus is the king, and he's feeding people with bread and fish, and they're satisfied. And he's not even satisfied with what happened at his own banquet, because he's like, oh man, someone lost their head. So it is just odd that you're comparing what the world's ideal is, to have everything on a plate, to eat as much as you want, to gorge yourself almost like slothfully or gluttonously on anything that you want, and somehow that would bring you satisfaction in a meal. And God's saying, no, it depends on how you eat and the way you eat and where you get your sustenance from. You can have a great meal with just the Lord and just his presence. So it is kind of comparing those two. You think that's the pinnacle is to party, drugs, sex, and rock and roll and food and everything, and that didn't make him happy, and it's not going to make you happy. So you see that even in the rock star that Herod is in the present chapter.
Yeah, I always find this strange, the way that we translate this, but then it's this idea, for many were coming and going, they had no leisure to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now, many saw them and recognized them, and they ran on foot. So wait, you just said they got away to the desolate place, but they didn't get away to the desolate place by themselves, did they? it needs to be translated, and they attempted, and this was how they attempted to get moving.
And we know the desolate place is important because it's mentioned 3 times in this passage.
Gosh, it's all over the place.
So the text is trying to tell you this is important.
There's nowhere to eat. There's not going to be any food found here.
Yeah. And, well, also just the location must be important. There's something important about the desolate place.
Well, and this gets into the Exodus conversation.
Yeah, these are the echoes of the Exodus.
Because right away we have him having gathered his leaders, gathered the 12 tribes with him, because there's 12 apostles.
There's 12 apostles.
It's not there.
Symbolic number.
But we know the apostles have been named as 12 of them. That just happened earlier. And so they come in 2 by 2. They all gather together. Now they're going to go away. They're so busy they don't have any time to eat. Then they go away, and they're going to go cross some water to a wilderness. I mean, well, I may be stretching the analogy a bit, but in the Exodus, they crossed through some water into the wilderness. They didn't go into the wilderness and wanderings and stuff until post the walk through the Red Sea. But that might be a bit of a stretch there, but that is kind of this is a picture of Israel roaming in the wilderness. That's the term used here. In fact, I believe that's the term even in
the wandering in the wilderness.
Yeah, go ahead and just kind of, what did you...
From that passage? Well, the idea of bread being involved, that the bread of life is being given to a people in a desolate place. Those are the words that are used in the Old Testament when they have no food and they're asking from Moses to feed them, and the manna starts falling from heaven. So the link is there in that kind of connection. And it makes a point of saying that they're in the wilderness when this is happening, and they're like, we're going to die here, and we don't have any way to feed them. And it's similar to what the disciples say here, which is send them away. That we don't have any way to feed them.
Exodus 14:12. Was this not the thing that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? It's better for us to be slaves than the Egyptians than to die in this wilderness.
Yeah.
We're hungry. It's all that kind of, it's really interesting because that is the word, a wilderness.
Yeah, it's the
all
same.
The Old Testament in the Greek version of the Old Testament.
And so anytime you hear a repetitive phrase of wilderness 3 times, it's going to draw you to those Exodus moments. And here we have 2 links. We have those 3 desolate comments, but we also have the bread. And this bread being fed from the one who fed the bread originally, which was God. And God is going to do it again and is going to provide. But you see it in a more relational way than you even did in Exodus.
So when we get into this, we have terms like rest, which is very Sabbath-like.
Well, it's Sabbath, but it's more the word Noah, which is the resting in the Noach word in the Hebrew that it translates over. But it could be both of those words as well. There's 2 words. There's Sabbath, the Shabbat word, to Seba, to rest, and then the other one is Noach, which is resting in the ark. That kind of picture of resting in the ark's safety. So both of those two come up in the passage, and anytime you have a boat, which is going to come up in the next part of the story, you're going to get a bit of a Noah connection as well. But all of it's trying to show you that this person's acting out parts of the Old Testament.
Yeah, actually, I just looked up the Greek term, which is anapao, and it says Exodus 23:12, 6 days you will do your work, but on the 7th day there's a time of rest, in order that your ox and beast of burden may rest, in order that your son or your female slave and the sojourner may rest. And those last 2 rests are the same exact word. And then it says in Leviticus, you'll have a rest during its Sabbaths to the Lord.
It's also the same word when Jesus says, come to me, those of you who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. It's that word. It's a relational rest. And
it's also the Deuteronomy term for that Sabbath commandment. So there is a connection here to Sabbath that's pretty strong in my mind. So
it is also the principle of resting is also something that the Sabbath is demonstrating, but also just in any kind of sustenance relationship with the Lord. You're talking about daily bread here. So there's a daily resting and abiding in Christ that one does, but then there's a day that you take to completely act that out in the commandment as well, in the Old Testament at the very least.
And again, your point in the sermon, just to kind of give application, was that when we rest, we don't veg out, we don't do our own deal and have me time. No, it's actually is who you spend time with. You spend time with the Lord of the Sabbath, with Jesus.
Well, when Noah got into the ark and God shuts the door, the idea, the picture is that he's on the inside with them too, right? So the idea is he's everywhere, but also he's sustaining their safety in the ark. And so everyone else is forsaken, and the people on the inside of the ark are protected. And the idea of resting with the Lord is that relational idea. I think that we've gotten to the habit of separating it because it's about me. And that kind of rest isn't really satiate or satisfying in any sense. So God's like, even in the Old Testament, when God rests, quote unquote, he doesn't stop caring about people. He doesn't like veg out and then be like, the world just falls to pieces. He's still doing good in his period of rest. He's still God. Nothing changes about that. And so the idea of resting is not necessarily about that, but reconnecting with a relationship.
So how do I know I'm resting correctly? Like, should I walk away from the
that's
event?
the thing that's creative, and I wish we had more books and things on that. What does rest look like when in a relationship? So the closest thing I can think of is when you go on vacation with people you love. And
you illustrated that.
And so for me, like, okay, I can watch. I know it sounds dumb, but you can watch a good program with God in your mind at some point. I don't like in my personal life. I spend a lot of time because I'm single by myself. I don't like to have single moments. I want to have a continual conversation with the Lord because that keeps me on the right track. I notice for me, the more I just stop having thoughts, just stop thinking about God, the more I get into stuff because I wasn't paying attention to where I was or what I was doing. So for me, I'm trying to be creative and enjoy when I enjoy life to figure out how do I bring God into the conversation. So I watch a funny program. I'm like, oh man, I just love the fact that God created humor. It's just a thought I have. It's not like, oh God, let's sit and talk for 6 hours or have a Bible study. It's just like having your father there or your friend or someone who you care about, you want to spend time with, you want to enjoy good times with them. I don't want all of my time about the Lord to just be about how bad of a sinner I am. So everything I read is, oh, I'm bad here, I'm bad here. That is a part of being in Christianity, is seeing your real self. But I think like Jesus says, hey, I want to hear the good stories and I want to be a part of your life too. And that's a form of abiding in both your sin and both your good points when you're doing God. I think he wants to be there in those moments to be a part of it. So,
one of the things people will often say is like, well, I don't feel like God's here with me and I don't feel like he's around and I want to just go, like when I was first as a Christian. I'm like, yeah, let me explain. Because in my life, it's been an interesting journey in my marriage, right? So I'm an introvert and my wife's an introvert. And we both will talk about the fact that as introverts, when we first got married, we were exhausted because we were coming home to each other and we weren't used to having another person always around, right? And you're just like, oh, can I get alone? I just need to get and just to recharge. And so you always felt them. It's like, I'm trying to read and you're in the room and now I feel this obligation. I got to talk to you because I'm uncomfortable that we're not, comfortable in the silence or whatever and just sitting around and being by ourselves or together enjoying different things in the same room, whatever it is. I found this with friends too. It's like, no, we got to always be
doing something,
or talking, and you just can't be like, oh, you're sitting there reading your book, I'm reading my book, and if I want to connect, I lift up my head and ask a question. And now, what's interesting is we're so comfortable with each other, we can be literally feel like we're quote unquote alone when we're in the same room, and the danger there is that we forget that we're there and to reference the intimacy. So we don't contact one another. And I think that fits a lot with like how we are with God in rest, is that he's always there with us. And he's like, rest is, you're just resting with me, but then you look up and we can connect. Don't ignore me. Don't think that I'm not around. I'm present and I'm talking to you sometimes and you're not listening and you're talking to me and I'm always listening, right? And so I think there's some of that's in here. Just the idea again that this is Jesus. This is the Lord of the Sabbath. This is the Yahweh on earth who's invited you to come away with him and rest. And that's what he's doing here with the disciples.
I had this thought too, that we have a lot of this idea that resting is mindlessness. It's almost like we call mindlessness sometimes. I noticed this.
Isn't that weird?
It is weird to go
especially
I'm
in the
going to be
Buddhist
mindful
world.
and I'm going to empty my mind. I'm like, that's not a good idea.
That's not mindful.
That's mindless. And so to me, the idea, they say that a lot of times what happens to people that struggle with attention or focus isn't the fact that they need to empty their mind, is that they need to singularly focus on one thing and rule out the others. So what does that mean? That means like if I need to rest on the Lord, I singularly want to have that be the thoughts, and they need to be a variety of thoughts about the one subject. It's like when you're watching something you really like, and then you're like, oh, what about the the dryer, and then what about this, and what about that? That all has to drop. That noise has to drop, and you have to put that creativity towards the one thing. And that's what it means to be focused on the Lord, is to engage in many areas of how to relate to someone, not just like, God, speak to me all the things that are wrong with me. Because I do think that's a large percentage of what we're trying to do with the Bible. God speaks in a lot of things when I'm focused on, like, I was just looking out the window. I'm going, God, you created all of that. Why? And I'm just having these thoughts.
Yeah.
They're not negative, and they're helpful for someone who does have a problem with not trying to focus on things that are negative. So to me, that makes the experience more meaningful, and it feels more relational. And also to really wrestle with your own feelings, in order to focus it actually on the Lord in your rest, it does mean there's some discipline involved. I know that seems the opposite of resting. There's a discipline to resting, that you have to worry about the distractions of everything that would get in the way of your primary relationship.
So what I love about this, just to recap, like, we got Jesus, who is the Lord, saying, come be with me in a desolate place where nobody else is going to distract you.
Yeah.
You're going to be with me. And so he's saying, let's go rest there. They go out and just like Israel is like, I'm going to take you away from civilization. Israel, you're going to be with me as a pillar of fire. I'm going to show up on a mountain. You're going to be my people, away from the distractions of Israel, before I drop you into Canaan. We're in this wilderness, desolate place with me. And that's the idea. He's like, because it was very clear that he was saying, you're going with me. And so it was very disastrous when God said, I'm not going with you anymore. And Moses is like, no. Who are we if you don't go with us?
You are in the wilderness then.
And so those echoes are all in here. And so it goes on, though, because they're not going to be alone for very long. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. And now many saw them going and recognized them. And they ran there on foot from all the towns and got ahead of them. That's verse 33. And when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them.
Yeah.
And because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Now, there's so much in these sections. There. First of all, just kind of a funky thing. People go like, how in the world can a crowd run in front of a boat? The Sea of Galilee isn't so large that these people couldn't see a slow moving ship and go, oh, that's Jesus' ship, because they knew it, and run out there. All 5,000 or whatever probably weren't there waiting. It was a big enough crowd. But it was gathering more and more steam as they were all there. So,
yeah, I mean, you think of if you had at the very least a large group of people coming and going, and then saying, "Oh, there he is!" They used to recognize the boat. Go back into the town, tell everybody, and then they run back out, and then more people come, and then other people come, and then people are going from town to town. I heard Jesus is here. That's not hard to imagine in that area. That location's not that huge. So I didn't find that all that impossible for me. I know a lot of people will criticize that, but I'd love to see that experiment done. It'd be really easy to do.
I love how this guy says, they had every right to be annoyed with the crowd. Jesus had every right to be annoyed with the crowd. They had prevented him and his disciples from getting their much needed rest. But instead, he has compassion on them.
Well, because why? This is, to me, we talked about this personally. The boat is a picture of the church. And oftentimes the church likes
eventually people they will interpret it as a picture of the church.
You have Jesus and the disciples, right? And they're together, and they're in this water, and usually there's storms and all these things are happening, but God is sustaining them each time they're in the water. So it's an ideal picture of the church.
What is Jesus? Where's the word preached from?
From the boat, right?
Jesus goes, "Let me get in your boat and preach." Then they go out, and where do they become fishers of men? From the boat.
Yeah.
And then they go out and they are literally going through the tortures of life, but they're safe in the boat because Jesus is in the boat. When are they not safe? When Jesus isn't in the boat. And then he shows up on the boat and everything's calm. The boat, yeah, you're right. The boat has been classically seen as a picture of rest and safety, and therefore is the picture of the church.
So what's the temptation of the church? To just care only about its own rest. When its primary job, that oftentimes means a sacrifice on their part, is to give up some of their rest time when Jesus is compassion on somebody. And it's not that you go out there and do it yourself. Well, I got to do this and Jesus is sending you. No, he goes and has compassion, and then he teaches, and then they go because of the teaching. I like that order. I like that idea that I'm following Jesus' model of compassion. And then I did talk a little bit about the difference in biblical compassion and our modern version of compassion as well. And so to me, the idea we have about compassion is people going to someone and making them feel good about their situation. And if you've ever heard Jesus preach, that's not what he's doing oftentimes. And if you read this passage in John, the same story, it's a pretty harsh message, and so Jesus is having compassion and telling them something they need to hear. And he's doing it for several hours. So I think
in chapter 1. This is the first time, if that may be the first time Jesus shows compassion, or this may be the first time Jesus shows compassion in the book of Mark, which is interesting because in this case, this compassion is associated to a conversation of shepherding.
Which is a lot of Old Testament connections.
Right. And for me, the deepest Old Testament connection comes in the book of Ezekiel. And in Ezekiel, I think it's...
There's a couple of them. There's Ezekiel there. There's also... there's a lot of connection to the Davidic line when you're talking about a shepherd king. The idea that the one Messiah would come and be like David, who is a shepherd king.
Yeah. In this case, I just found the Ezekiel passages in chapter 34 very, very fascinating because I'll just kind of read some of them for you. Ezekiel is told to make a prophecy against the shepherds of Israel. This would be the leaders.
This is 34:23, correct?
Just 34 at the beginning. And so he's just going to tell them what they don't do. So you've been feeding yourselves. This is weird because you got the word feeding going on here. It is shepherds of Israel who have been feeding yourselves. Should not shepherds feed the sheep? You eat the fat. You clothe yourselves with the wool. You slaughter the fat ones. Literally, they're killing off using the Israelites for their own gain. They're feeding off the sheep instead of feeding the sheep. The weak you have not strengthened. The sick you have not healed. Whoa, who's this starting to sound like? The injured you have not bound up. The strayed you have not brought back. The lost you have not sought. I mean, this echoes of Jesus like crazy. He leaves the 99, goes after the one. He's the one who heals and he binds people up. And the lost you've not sought, and with force and harshness you have ruled them instead of with compassion. So they were scattered because there was no shepherd.
Yeah, this is after the exile.
And then Ezekiel's speaking from from Babylon. He's a prophet living in Babylon as he's preaching. And he's saying this, they became food for all the wild beasts. My sheep were scattered. They wandered all over the mountains and on every high hill. My sheep were scattered over the face of the earth with no one to seek or search them. Therefore, you shepherds, hear the word Lord, as I declare, because my sheep have become prey, my sheep have become food. He goes on and he condemns them. But then he says this in verse 11, for thus says Yahweh, Lord Yahweh, behold, I myself will search for my sheep and will seek them out, as a shepherd seeks out his flock when he's among his sheep that have been scattered. So I will seek out my sheep, and I will rescue them from all places they've been scattered on a day of clouds, thick darkness. I will bring them back out of the peoples. So he does this whole thing about how he's going to bring them out. And he says, I myself, verse 15, will be the shepherd of my sheep, and I myself will make them lie down, declares Lord Yahweh. I will seek the lost. I will bring back the strayed. I will bind up their wounds. I will strengthen the weak and the fat and the strong, and I will feed them in justice. As for you, my flock, thus says Lord Yahweh, behold, I judge between sheep and sheep, between rams and male goats. Right? Is it not enough that for you to feed on the good pasture that you must tread down with your feet the rest of your pasture? It's like now he's ending up in Psalm 23 kind of language here. And so,
if you get to 23, are you?
Go ahead.
It says, and I will, and this is talking about Yahweh, will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them, and he shall feed them in their and be their shepherd. And so you have, and remember, I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David shall be prince among them, and I am Yahweh, I have spoken.
And remember, David's already dead.
He's dead. Yeah, he's already
long dead.
Yeah.
So this is not the David. It's like the kingly line of David. This is such a prophetically beautiful section. And this is what I believe it's pointing back to.
Yeah.
It is yelling and screaming, he is the shepherd.
He's the Messiah, shepherd,
the
king.
Messiah shepherd, Yahweh himself, because that's a trippy section in Ezekiel where Yahweh is both the shepherd and he's going to set up David as the shepherd, which is this implication that they're the one and the same. And so here is this Christological. People go like, well, how do you know where does Mark say that Jesus is God? Well, hello.
Well, you're going to see it here in a minute too.
Yeah, this is a huge one that I think that he had no reason. And the reason I bring all this up, Mark had no reason to say because he saw them as one without a shepherd.
He's doing things not if you have to be a bit of a detective here too, because you start watching these things, they're very hard to ignore if you're a first century mindset. If you're looking at it from the time of this was written, these stuff are messianic. He is acting messianic in the things that are being written about him and the things that he's saying. And you can easily overlook that because we're so familiar with the words from our side. But for them, some of these are revolutionary. You know, the wave walker, the one who walks on the waves, the one who...
Yeah, we'll get to that in a second here.
These are messianic statements, you know. So I do believe he's declaring that. And then the passage you just read is telling him that I, Yahweh, and then that's what Jesus is doing.
Yeah.
And so the idea that he's not claiming to be God is really hard to overlook if you're really paying attention.
And so he has compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Hello. And he began to teach them many things. I will feed them with justice, right? He is going to lead them. And
separating the sheep from the sheep as well.
Yeah, that was in the sheep and the goats commentary. That's crazy.
But also he put them in groups.
Mm-hmm.
So
when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, this is a desolate place and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside, the villages, buy themselves something to eat. Oh, here we are. We're in the desolate place again. And what are we complaining about?
Food.
We're hungry. This is Exodus language. Like Mark's just like pulling all kinds of Old Testament stuff, like wrapping it all together. Send them away into the surrounding countryside. And he answered them, you give them something to eat. This is very different than manna from heaven. This wasn't
now he's
Moses,
changing
you
it.
give it.
Yeah.
This is adjustment. This is a difference in what you would expect. And they said to him, shall we go buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? And you said that was how many thousands?
$16,000 to $20,000, and because it's a day's wage at denarii. So if you calculate it that way, it's quite a bit of bread. Someone calculated the number of loaves. It's an astounding number.
So, and was that pre the increase in?
I just actually looked it up.
Wage?
I said if a denari's day wage, if a day wage in our current era, how much money would that be in current eras if a denarii is a day?
So he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they had found out, they said 5 and 2 fish. And he commanded them to sit down in groups on the green grass. Now, this gets into some interesting stuff here, because not only is he going to provide manna, bread, through the church, through the disciples.
Which is not what he did with Moses.
No.
Moses asked the bread from God. Now God's telling us to give him the bread. He's going to be involved still, but he's asking another person to do it.
And people are like, fish though? Like, remember, it wasn't just manna that God gave to Israel. He also gave them quail.
He gave them meat.
So it was meat and bread. So this still is imaging that concept. So 5. So and then they multiply it. And so, but then they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. Go ahead, talk about that military language thing that you were frustrated with.
So I'm reading a lot of the commentaries, and some of the commentaries seem to struggle with Jesus using command language, like a military leader would use. And you see this oftentimes when he's giving commands. And there's this idea, even through the Old New Testament, that it's not a physical military, and there's no aggression about it. I'm like, okay, I get that, but it's not less aggressive when it comes to like following orders. Like not all the orders in the military are to kill people. Most of them are not.
Right, actually.
Most of them are just obeying when someone commands you to do something in submission to their authority. And Jesus is using this language all over. And I think that God wants to take that model of what used to be a physical aggression and use that same aggressive language to talk about how he wants things to be organized and ordered with the same intensity, with the same kind of veracity. And the idea of being a spiritual warrior, to me, as a young kid, it's always struck me as strong. But also to this day, I think it invokes, especially for men, the spirit of fighting for a good cause, which I think people need to do. kind of live in a society that wants to downplay like being aggressive. And I'm like, well, it depends on what you're aggressive against, right? I aggressively should attack sin if it's in my heart and in my life. If it's in people I love, I should aggressively get to the situation and remove it as if it's dangerous, like it's a landmine. You know, these are the languages we would be using nowadays if we were using modern warfare language to talk about some of these principles. But we live in an era that's so used to
nuke the sin in your heart.
You got to microwave that till it's dead, right? You got to get rid of it. You know, you've got to cut it out. Those are extreme, kind of like, you know, when you're in battle and your arm's killing you and you're going to die if you don't cut it off, they take your hand and they whack it off.
Yeah, I think it's really silly that we do downplay the military, considering the centerpiece of so much of the Christian mindset is a military thing. The cross was not it was used for rebels.
Right.
It was used to shame. It was a military
rebels.
It was a military death
punishment.
And so it was used to against the armies of their enemies, to shock warfare you into submission. These are people who were raised, not these old pacifists sitting around, and they were raised to fight. They were raised to defend themselves. They were raised to argue. They
argued a lot, but also
had a lot of Romans around them.
The idea, if you find the background of this story and then the other tellings of the story in the other Gospels, they were trying to make him their king, and he was not going to have it. He's giving them orders to sit and listen to him teach, not take your orders. And that's important because I think God is sovereign. And if you want him to be your king, then you have to listen to him. You can't make him a king in your own image. And so the militaristic idea of leadership, I think, is what the value of it is, what I think Paul picks up on. I think it's what Jesus is using. And it's the reason why the Old Testament is set up that way, is to take that aggression and funnel it into a spiritual battle, not necessarily against flesh and blood.
Not to mention, the ancient mindset didn't divide the military and the civilian.
Right.
It was if you were of a certain,
you're in the city,
if you were of a certain age, you were a fighting man. You had to understand. You could be called up to fight for your town,
protection, defense
at any point. So every child understood how to wield appropriately.
Probably played with a sling. Probably ran out in the field through spears.
They understood
sticks.
their weaponry. Yeah. They knew what they needed to do. They had some kind of military understanding, so that when it came time and they were called up to fight, they could do so.
Yeah.
This is throughout the Old Testament. This is throughout every civilization until we got a modernized warfare mentality that the civilian could sign up, but they weren't expected to be a part. This is honestly, it's why most of our military would come from like the kind of the more rural areas, because they were comfortable with weaponry. They understood how to handle themselves in certain situations.
So what I'm saying is like in the ancient middle and a lot of cultures, like in Japan, but also in Middle Ages, a lot of what we call chivalry was developed so that people would stop being murderous and killful.
Right.
So I understand the tendency of human nature to just be brutal, especially the male side of aggression in a negative, sinful sense will lead to that. But I wouldn't take that away in the same kind of protective ordinance that's required.
And look, I've been to seminary, and I'll just tell you, I had a couple really awesome professors that played in like the European NFL, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And dude, those guys, they understood this stuff. But your average professor, they may want to play a little sports here or watch some sports there, but they're not typically your ex-military guy. They're not typically the person who's going to like jump up and like want to get into a fist fight. They're bookish. They're people who are
they're men of the tent.
Yeah, they're not going. And so I do notice that there's a downplaying of the military language that subsumes the text. And even in this place where Jesus is not just the shepherd. Remember, a shepherd was a picture of leadership. They were supposed to be leading the people, and instead they were killing their sheep. David's a king. That's a war. Kings are military leaders, and that's what's so hard thing to remember. Most of the time how did David become a king? Because he was the hero in a battle, and many battles. You followed the guy you thought, I could follow him into battle. Let's make him the king. That's how we think of kings. Yeah. We don't think that way because we elect and we do these kinds of very non-militaristic forms of leadership. But then we expect our leader to be able to handle the battle when he finally gets there. That's why Washington was our first president. We're like, we need a guy who can handle the fights.
Yeah.
Let's vote for that guy. And then Congress had its own. We're supposed to be the tent guys sitting around who've been arguing over things. But that's a whole other problem.
Yeah, I want there to be a balance to I understand that we don't go around looking for a fight, but I don't think when one's presented to us, we should run away. Oh my gosh, and
especially in the spiritual realm.
Yeah. And especially when it comes to sin in someone's life that you love, you want to passionately fight for that.
As a pastor, I would encourage you guys, if you're watching, listening to this, and I don't care if you're a man or a woman, you should be always looking for the fight. The fight's coming to you, and it's a spiritual fight. I'm not talking about physical fight, but if we would actually stop disengaging our minds in rest and realize, oh no, I'm always on the lookout. I'm on a fight. When Jesus says, keep your eyes open, be like a watchman. These are military terms. These are, I had a friend who had to be a watchman in Alamogordo, and he said it was just horrible. He stood there bored all the time because he just had to watch this gate, and no one was coming.
You're in the middle of the wilderness, literally the wilderness at that point.
Yeah.
And there's nothing to watch, but if you fall asleep, you're toast.
And so there is just this difficulty in that realm.
I had to do some of that.
We have to be on guard, be ready to fight, be ready to deal with the spiritual slings and things that are coming. Are we armed? Are we prepared to battle with the Word of God? To not with it, but use it as a weapon, as a means to defeating spiritual evil in our souls and in our lives. And so I love this. I do like that the shepherd's going to lead you into the appropriate spaces and feed you. And so that there's just a lot there that I just wanted to dive into. So he goes on.
One of my pet peeves I'm just starting to learn from going from the old to the new now, just recently. I'm starting to see that God changes that energy, but it doesn't disappear.
No, it's all so there. It's
it's not brutal just to be brutal. It's actually there to show how bad sin can be.
So it goes on, verse 41, taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, said a blessing, and broke the loaves, and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all, and they all ate and were satisfied, and they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and the fish, and those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. And so this is a massive crowd of people for 5 loaves and 2 fish.
Yeah, you just counted the men real quick, But probably for distribution reasons as well, but yeah.
Really odd, was the idea of that you were saying, like somebody was talking about, like this is a fish that's
weird. Yeah, so it says
pure.
He took the 5 loaves and the fish, and he looked up to heaven and said blessings and broke the loaves and gave them. So does he just keep breaking the same loaf and it just keeps growing? Like I'm curious. These are things I want to know.
Did one finally run out, and so he's like, okay, now I'll start on this one,
and then it just keeps growing. And then
but he's manufacturing matter,
making bread out of nothing. There's nothing there, and the bread is continuing to come. There's fish that just wasn't. There's only so much fish, and it just keeps coming. So this is there's no way that this. There's a lot of commentaries that try to excuse this away as some kind of, they try to do like a magic trick about, this is what happened really.
And they were all got so generous. They handed out,
this is literally saying he's breaking it off and giving it, and it just keeps coming.
He is showing he is the creator.
Yeah, I can create things. I'm God. This is totally a miracle. I don't know how you would take this.
I mean, one of the
why you'd want to.
If you watch The Chosen, I know I've said that a couple times. They always start off before they eat or drink. They say, "Thank you, Lord God, who makes the bread come from the earth." I mean, this was a daily prayer for them. And here Jesus going, I'm making the bread come. I'm making the bread appear through you, and I'm distributing it through the church. So critical. This is the provision of God given to the church for the fulfilling of the world. One of the things we'll get into in a couple of weeks is that it's to the church first, then to the world.
To the world.
And this is how Jesus works here. He's going, I'm working through my church. He's not working through NGOs. He's not working through... I had a long conversation with a friend last night about like all this USAID stuff. He's like, oh my gosh, we're killing malaria. Do you think all that money is going to come back to the church and flow through the church? I'm like, no, not all of it is. And I'm not opposed to some governmental aid. I'm just opposed to the things that are not spiritual, or the things that are spiritual being used. Like that's not okay. But more importantly to me, I still believe that I want the church to be the greatest use by God. And he is saying, I can provide all the needs and satisfy people through my church.
And I guarantee you, if you really looked at the groups that are organizations that are involved in even in Israel and places right now, most of them are Christians.
They are. They are. And the ones that aren't are typically just existing to exist and continuing.
There's people that just put themselves in harm's way to go give supplies and things to people in countries. Like there's the church in Gaza,
Yeah.
And so
we're not a local entity. Yeah. It's a global entity. And so there's this beautiful picture of Jesus working through. And so finally we get to the next famous story. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat.
I always laugh at immediately because it's Mark's favorite word.
Yeah, it is.
It just shows up everywhere and it makes me laugh.
Yutos.
Immediately.
And
I don't
like,
know
how many immediately happen?
Yeah. They have Peter just constantly saying, immediately we need to go do this thing. That would be funny. I would laugh. That would be a very inside joke, but
we need immediately. So immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and to go before him to the other side to Bethsaida. By the way, they won't make it to Bethsaida.
Yeah,
they'll end up somewhere else. While he dismissed the crowd. Now this is really weird. He says, "Let's get away and get rest. Oh, big crowd. Let me teach you.
Yeah.
In fact, let me provide through you. And guess what? You rested. You were with me. You didn't have to teach."
You got to eat?
You got to eat. I gave you were filled. In fact, you did some work, but it was a meaningful, amazing thing that happens. Now, I'm going to let you guys get in the boat. I'll dismiss the crowd. I'll do the hard work of telling everybody to go away.
He did the hard work of doing the miracle, and now he's doing the hard work of dismissing. And those are militaristic words. Dismissed.
Dismissed.
You're dismissed.
No, we dismiss the congregation every week.
And that's the thing that's really interesting is that, if you read the John account, this is not a good, they're arguing, how can this be that we have to eat his body and drink his blood? Oh my, and they didn't like that, you know what I mean? And so he's still dismissing, okay, you're dismissed. So I find that to be interesting.
It's like, I'm done. And he's like,
you don't have to believe it. I'm just telling you the truth.
And go. And then
you need to leave now. You're good.
And he's dismissing the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, both the disciples and the crowd.
Yeah.
He leaves them alone. He went up on the mountain to pray. And this is like one of those things. He goes up to a mountain. Now, these are not mountains like we think of mountains in Southern California.
A high place.
This is just a high place, a hill, somewhere that's going to be elevated. He can still see out. But notice that evening's coming. So he's climbed up this hill. He's up there praying. He can see where the boat is. So they've sailed out somewhat, but the sun hasn't fallen completely because when it does, he's not going to be able to see him anymore. That's just the nature of how things work, unless they had a lantern.
He walks down to the land.
So when evening came, the boat was out on the sea and he was alone on the land. So he is now spending time with his father after a hard day of all doing this stuff. And that was convicting to me. We had talked about this because I'm the kind of guy who's like, oh man, it's been so hard. And it's like, I want to veg out instead of like, oh no, Jesus just worked the hardest in all this passage. And he just goes out and spends time with the Father at night to pray. And I'm like, man, I just got to up my game a little bit when it comes to connecting with the Lord.
Yeah, I think that for any minister or pastor, if you want to pray for them after they preach, because I do feel like the first thing you want to do is rest, but there are things that happen that you have to take care of.
You get so attacked.
Yeah, and so I just feel like that rest, I did try to practice that. So for me, because that is a hard time after I preach, it just feels like a downer. I don't know why.
It always does. Totally. Same thing here.
And so it just feels empty and quiet. Everything is just, and so
it's like you emptied yourself now and you're like,
now what? How did that work? Was that okay? Not talking about from the people, but from the Lord, right? And, you do want to hear some things that hopefully that was helpful. But when you go home at night, it's easier to focus on myself. Instead, I did try to spend a little more time trying to practice that, and it did help a lot with that kind of slump that happens to a lot of ministers. So pray for them after they minister.
And so this is crazy. So Jesus is up on this hill. He's watched them. He sees they're struggling, and he saw they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night,
he waited quite a while.
He waited a long time. The fourth watch of the night is somewhere between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. It's been all night.
All night, yeah.
He has spent the night talking to the Lord, knowing his disciples are struggling out there,
and talking with God,
and somehow knowing where they're at. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea, and he meant to pass them by. This is that critical, interesting language in two locations. First and foremost is the location you brought up in the book of Exodus,
which is my favorite verse in the Old
Which
Testament.
is where Yahweh is going to pass by Moses and Moses is only going to see the glory of the Lord. And as he passes by, he's going to say his name. the Lord, I am a God gracious and merciful, full of compassion is actually one way to translate that term. And we just saw a lot of the very things that
who he was
doing here in the bread. And so later they're going to say they were hardened because they didn't see the bread. Well, no, they didn't notice that he was
the God of the bread. He was
Yahweh, shepherd, king in the wilderness, feeding
provider,
you, giving.
Ruler.
He's the provider. He's Yahweh, right? And so it means to pass them by, which is a weird term, but that also shows up in the book of Job. One commentator pointed out, and it literally uses the exact same verbs, the exact same way as they're going as this section of the book of Job.
What section in Job?
It's Job chapter. Give me 1 second here. So the section in Job though was interesting. My thing just jumped. So it was interesting because he's saying that if he had passed me by, I wouldn't even have seen him. So there's this kind of terminology that he's the wave walker is the concept. And so let me see if I can pull it up.
Yeah, it's interesting because you don't always pick some of these, I don't know what you call them, but they're like little phrases that are kind of used specifically to bring a pattern up in the Old Testament. In this text, it's passing by.
Job 9:8. It says this. This is really interesting. Speaking about the Lord, Job is speaking. It says, who speaks to the sun and does not rise? Concerning the stars, he seals them up. Concerning his messengers, he thinks some are crooked. Who stretched out the sky alone and walks about upon the sea as upon a floor? Who made the Pleiades and Hesperus, the bear, and the chambers of the south winds? Who does great and inscrutable things with glorious and extraordinary, which cannot be numbered? If he should pass over me or pass by me, I would not notice. And if he should pass by me likewise, I would not perceive. And there's this picture that's the same term to pass by as is. He's the wave walker, the one walking on the seas.
You got a double connection there to
right. And so a lot point out that this is really odd. Here's a guy in a storm of life, like struggling through horrible things, like Job is, and the
disciples are,
and the disciples are, and Jesus is going to be the wave walker. He's just going to pass him by, and he's going to do that. It's just and he's walking on the waves. That critical walking on the waves stuff has a long history. In fact, Baal was originally called the wave walker.
Yeah.
And he was worshipped in the territory of the Sea of Galilee. And basically, the people of the Old Testament, the Jewish people of the Israelites were like, no, Baal's not it. No. And so they wrote these hymns, they wrote these thoughts. No, our God's the wave walker. Our God rides on the clouds. Our God's the one who does these things.
Yeah.
And almost mocking
it's a mocking because Baal had to wrestle with Leviathan and kill it in order to have, I think it was Tiamat. He kills and creates the peace that's created. God doesn't have to do that. He just orders things and they happen. And so when he gets in the boat, it just ceases. There's no wrestling match with another deity in order to bring about peace.
Storm is done.
Yeah, the storm's over with. So he's one stronger. And to imagine, though, in the ancient world, seeing that demonstrated, like you've been told about all these gods and all these myths, but then you watch this person walk and then the water just cease. When they get into a boat, you're like, that's kind of like, oh my gosh, this is real.
So we see this. He's walking on the sea. He meant to pass them by, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought he was a ghost. And I said to you after second service, like, you missed the perfect joke for you, man.
Who is it? I'm Batman.
Like, oh my gosh, Holy Ghost disciples. And Jesus gets in the boat and says, almost
different hero,
different person. We're both God. Yes, I'm a holy one. That's like Holy Ghost, Batman.
Yeah, Holy
I just thought it would be funny. That's a really bad joke. There you go, Brent. Anyway, so he meant to pass them by, but when they saw him, they thought it was a ghost. Now, also, I love to point out to people, the Jewish people thought there were ghosts.
Yeah,
we get into this like, oh, the Bible doesn't endorse. I know he wasn't a ghost, but they believed in ghosts. They thought as Jewish people there were ghosts. Now, does the Bible endorse ghosts?
That's a good question to send in.
It's a different question, but and we don't have time for that. But it freaks them out, so they're screaming out. They're freaking out. I would freak out. Dude, somebody walking toward me, a figure on the water in the middle of a storm, I would be nuts scared.
You'd want him to pass you by.
And so immediately he spoke to them and said, take heart, or it is I, don't be afraid. That'd be really hard to want to listen. It'd be like, what is going on here?
I do like the fact that they should have known that this would have been God is kind of the implication. Like, this is God. And yet they didn't get it right. They didn't focus on the Lord being with them, even though they already had a similar thing where the storm was happening and Jesus was asleep. They woke him up and
he calms, and they're like, who is this man that even the storms?
And because he's not physically with them, they don't physically see his presence on the boat anymore. Somehow their faith is altered because of that. Their conception of Messiah, their conception of who God was, is not quite accurate in the way that they're looking at it. And so I think that you are going to see other supernatural beings and miss out on who God is because you're kind of not in the right setting. But his response is compassion. Take heart. Like, to be God's like, I know you're going to get it wrong, and I'm still rooting for you. And I love that about the Lord, that he's not just going to crush you, but he's going to give you opportunity after opportunity. And that's what you'll see in the text later on. Again, the hardening is not going to go away here. It kind of keeps going for quite some time.
But the beauty of the passage is that we know that you figure out really early that, this is Yahweh. That's what it's saying. They didn't realize.
It's ego on me, right? In the Greek.
Yeah, he literally says,
I am.
I am.
It's in the middle,
Take heart. I am. Do not be afraid.
So take heart. I am. Do not be afraid. To me, there's an importance for it.
It's very Mosaic. Like, look, no, I am. I will be with you. Yeah. And this is, I'm going to pass you by and say I am. This is Peter winking at us. Like, you know what's going on. Your heart's not hard. You know who made the bread in the wilderness. You know who provided meat in the wilderness. You know who organized the people in the wilderness. You know who numbered the adults only the men in the wilderness. This is Yahweh. I mean, how many different allusions? You know who walks on the water. You know who calms the storms. You know who was the one that passes by and says, I am. This is Yahweh. You don't have to be somebody who's hard like the disciples. They didn't get it. At first, they're thinking, he's my military Messiah. This is the best vending machine opportunity I've ever met.
Right.
He can provide us food. Think about these military. I think the military overtones were pointing to the fact that they thought he was the military Messiah who could provide food. Like this
the original
is going to be
Joshua
the greatest,
or David.
Right. We're going to be the greatest army. You can't conquer us. He's going to feed us when we're hungry.
Like, when do we start physically training?
Right.
He's doing all this spiritual training, but using the same language. I can see why the confusion was there, right? Because he's altering their perception of how we're going to fight.
He's opening their spiritual aperture.
Yeah.
And that's what I loved about this passage. I thought you did a great job. Hopefully, we're way over in our time.
Yeah.
Hopefully, you guys are still with us.
On the I am, though, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're just glad. If you're interested in learning more or hearing more about this, let us know what you're interested in us addressing or jumping into. You got some questions, you can drop us a line at our email, which again is rabbittrail@obcc.church. We would love to hear from you. And next time we will probably have our friend Brent back. So on behalf of Brent, I will say, hope you have a great week. Boom shakalaka.
Bye.